Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. lawmg.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.
Coming up on Indiana Newsdesk. America's newest national park sits in the shadows of some of the largest industrial companies in the nation. We look at how that industry affects tourism.
Visitors to national parks expect a certain experience. You expect clean air, you expect clean water, you expect natural vistas.
For the first time in history, the wealthiest Americans are paying less in taxes than the middle class. Coming up, an expert joins us to talk about how the tax burden has shifted over the years. Speaking this week in Indiana, the head of the EPA said federal regulations are not necessary to drive environmental progress.
Certainty and the innovation that thrives in a climate of certainty are the keys to progress.
Those stories, plus the latest news headlines from across the state, right now on Indiana Newsdesk. Welcome to Indiana Newsdesk. I'm Joe Wren. Now, the country's newest national park isn't like many of the others. It's surrounded by some of the largest industrial companies in the U.S. And while Indiana Dunes' new designation has drawn national attention, so have recent industrial spills in nearby Lake Michigan waterways. Indiana Public Broadcasting's Rebecca Thiel reports on whether the park's designation will pressure industrial companies to clean up their act.
So right here is kind of a good example of some of the things that make the Indiana Dunes National Park so special and why it's so biodiverse.
That's Dan Plath, the chief of resource management for the park. He gestures toward a prickly pear cactus surrounded by dune grass and sand. It's a plant you'd easily find in the desert.
But right behind it, you'll see this plant right here, these little green leaves here. And what that is Arctic bearberry.
A plant you'd typically find in colder regions, like up in Canada.
That's one of the reasons I get so excited about working for the park. You see things like this that are really not found anywhere else in the world.
But environmentalists say this delicate ecosystem is put under threat every day from pollution put out by industrial companies nearby. And the environment isn't the only thing at risk. Since Indiana Dunes became a national park in February, its visitor center has seen more people than it has in any of the past 8 years. This is the park's West Beach on a weekday afternoon. But just 6 months after the dunes became a national park, excess cyanide and ammonia leaked from a nearby steel facility owned by ArcelorMittal, killing about 3,000 fish and closing one of the park's beaches temporarily. After that, tourists weren't sure the dunes were safe. That affected businesses in the area. Here at the Spring House Inn, management says a lot of tourists canceled their reservations after the spill, and the inn only booked about half as many rooms as it anticipated. Now that the dunes are a national park, environmentalists say there's even more reason to protect it. Natalie Johnson is the executive director of the environmental group Save the Dunes. She says when the Port of Indiana was founded in the 1960s, it was supposed to show how you could have a sensitive ecosystem like the dunes alongside pollution-free industry.
And are we pollution-free? The answer is absolutely not.
The history of Indiana Dunes is closely tied with industry. The reason the dunes even became a national lakeshore is because it was part of a compromise back in the 1960s to allow the creation of the Port of Indiana, where many of those steel mills are today. Some say industrial companies in the Great Lakes Basin are already working hard to be good stewards of the environment. Kay Nelson is the Environmental Affairs Director for the Northwest Indiana Forum, a regional economic development organization.
The discharge permits for any and all entities surrounding all 5 of the Great Lakes have much more stringent standards for their municipal and industrial discharge facilities than, say, the rest of the state of Indiana that does not discharge into Lake Michigan.
But environmentalists say industry isn't doing enough. According to the Environmental Protection Agency, U.S. Steel and ArcelorMittal are among the top 5 companies for most toxic releases in Indiana since 2007. And Indiana overall has the 3rd highest toxic releases in the country per square mile. A parks advocacy group, the National Parks Conservation Association, says industrial air pollution, along with emissions from nearby Chicago, are likely having an effect on the plants and animals at the dunes. Colin Deverell is NPCA's Midwest Program Manager.
Visitors to national parks expect a certain experience. You expect clean air, you expect clean water, you expect natural vistas.
And Deverell says there should be consequences for companies that pollute the park. Back when Indiana Dunes was just known as a national lakeshore, U.S. Steel spilled about 300 pounds of the cancer-causing chemical hexavalent chromium into the Burns waterway, which feeds into Lake Michigan. The EPA still hasn't finalized a consent decree, which means the company has yet to pay fines for harm caused by the spill.
But what's really needed is that added layer of vigilance from people who come to national parks to say, we expect that clean air, we expect that clean water. So businesses, state and federal regulators, do your jobs and protect this place.
2 environmental groups say they'll sue ArcelorMittal if state and federal regulators don't hold the company accountable for its environmental violations. We could not get an interview with the Northwest Indiana industrial companies U.S. Steel, BP, or ArcelorMittal. Some of the companies pointed to funding they've given to area conservation programs. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Rebecca Thiel.
Well, a book by 2 UC Berkeley economic professors digs deep into the American tax system and finds some interesting conclusions. Now, the book won't be released until next week, but what it says about the tax contributions of the wealthiest Americans has reignited a debate about wealth in America. With us to talk about taxes and equity is David Gamage, a professor of tax law at Indiana University at the Maurer School of Law. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
So first, a short history of taxes in America, going maybe back to the 50s. What was the tax structure like back then to now?
Yeah, so at a high level, rates have gone down a lot. The ordinary income tax rate for the federal income tax used to be in the 90%, then the 70%, then the 50%, briefly down to 28%, now down up to 37%, the highest rate. The corporate income tax rate has gone down a lot as well. So this is one big trend. Along with that, tax gaming, tax avoidance has increased quite dramatically, or gotten more sophisticated, we should say, at the top end. And a key thing to point out here is prior to the 1986 tax reform, tax avoidance was done commonly, tax shelters, by both those who had high levels of labor, salary, wage income, and those who had high income from the return of wealth. The 1986 tax reform did a very good job of shutting down the major tax shelters, but only with respect to wage and salary income. So since the late 1980s, it's generally the case that the super rich, who mostly have income that either comes from the return to owning wealth and property, or that can be made to look like it does, can largely escape the federal income tax. But anyone who largely has wage and salary income, including many rich but not super rich folks, finds it very difficult to escape the federal income tax. So the federal income tax has become had broken at the top, not progressive at the very top with respect to the super rich.
So what does this mean for the folks that are at the bottom of the income brackets?
Yeah, I mean, one way to think about it is, imagine a world in which the tax code just said, we're going to slash taxes for the super rich. You know, that might be unfair, there'd be less government revenue. But that's not the world we live in. Instead, the world we live in, the super rich engage in complicated, economically damaging tax avoidance games to reduce their tax liabilities. Tax rules and structures at this top with capital and the super rich are all over the place in a way that damages the economy overall, also arguably is unfair and reduces federal revenues, and undermines the administrability of the entire tax system.
So we just have a few seconds left. You say this is troubling. What can be done to fix this?
I think there's great need for comprehensive tax reform, both for the high end and for our business tax system. More targeted approaches, I think a targeted moderate wealth tax at the super rich is an easier way to fix some of these problems in a sense than more fundamental tax reforms.
All right, so much to dig into. Thanks for being here today.
My pleasure.
Now we take a look at the latest stories from across the state. Indiana health officials are reporting 2 more Indiana residents have died of severe lung injuries linked to vaping. The new deaths reported by the State Department of Health brings the total number of vaping-related deaths in the state to 3 since early September. Now, most who have reported symptoms said they've used vapes containing THC, but others said they vaped only nicotine. Next week marks 1 month since striking United Auto workers walked off the job at General Motors facilities across the country. Strikers picketing outside the 4 GM facilities in Indiana are starting to feel the financial strains of the strike. In a letter published today, a GM official says it's critical that it and the UAW reach an agreement. Democratic State Senator Eddie Melton officially kicked off his run for governor this week after months of exploring a bid. The Gary lawmaker launched his campaign in his hometown while touting his bipartisanship and highlighting legislative accomplishments that passed the Republican General Assembly.
I will be a governor that works for all Hoosiers, not just a select few. I'll be a governor that prioritizes health care, education, and making a livable wage in the state of Indiana, and providing economic growth and opportunities for all Hoosiers, not just a chosen few.
Education was the primary focus of Melton's campaign kickoff. He was introduced by Republican State Superintendent of Public Instruction Jennifer McCormick. McCormick's presence fueled speculation the GOP elected official will be Melton's running mate, but Melton says it's too soon for that. He joins a Democratic primary race that includes healthcare executive Woody Myers and tech CEO Josh Owens. Well, millions of dollars will make its way to teachers across Indiana through a federal grant award announced this week, and that funding will help schools expand teacher development. It will support teachers and school leaders to grow a program called TAP. The program focuses on teacher training and mentorship and stresses the importance of additional pay for teachers with more responsibilities.
The vast majority will go towards teacher compensation and professional learning. So we have about $22 million going to Perry Township, almost $10 million going to Goshen, and then a little over $5 million going to Brown County.
TAP focuses on teacher training and mentorship. It also includes additional pay for teachers with more responsibilities. McQueen says the grant will allow the districts to use the program with more teachers. She says the funding will help school leaders grow TAP district-wide over the next 5 years. Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Andrew Wheeler was the special guest at a conference this week put on by the Indiana Chamber of Commerce. He touted the agency's rollbacks of the Waters of the United States rule and the Clean Power Plan. Wheeler says the EPA will also stop targeting specific industries like oil and gas and spend more time looking into what's causing poor air and water quality.
We're proving that burdensome and excessive federal regulations are not necessary to drive environmental progress. Certainty and the innovation that thrives in a climate of certainty are the keys to progress.
Wheeler says that moving forward, the EPA will put more power in the hands of the states and let state environmental agencies take the lead when it comes to implementing and enforcing federal programs. He also announced the EPA will loan Indiana more than $400 million to help fund 23 water infrastructure projects across the state, mostly in rural communities. The Bloomington Creative Glass Center will celebrate its 10th annual Glass Pumpkin Patch this weekend on the Monroe County Courthouse lawn. Alex Harrison reports.
Every year, thousands of hand-blown pumpkins are created in preparation for the Great Glass Pumpkin Patch. 10 years ago, Abby Gitlitz started this fundraiser with about 200 pumpkins. That year, she made all of them by herself.
Good.
But fast forward a decade later, and she has a team of more than 80 volunteers helping to create a multicolor glass pumpkin patch.
At the pumpkin patch, we invite people to come, bring their family, bring their kids, come interact with the glass, see what it is, see what we can do, get inspired to take a class so people start thinking, oh wait, maybe I could do that.
The Great Glass Pumpkin Patch funds educational programs for students and community members who want to learn more about glass blowing. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Alex Harrison.
The Great Glass Pumpkin Patch opens October 12th from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. Coming up next on Indiana Newsdesk. What happens when your yard becomes a drop-off site for motorized scooters? Our City Limits team looks at the ongoing story of scooters in Bloomington. And with honeybee populations in peril, the state of Indiana is trying to make it easier for Hoosiers to cultivate bees. These stories and more right here on Indiana Newsdesk.
The WTIU-WFYI News Team connects Indiana to the world. We bring you the top news of the day on radio, TV, and online. We round up the stories that have people talking each week and dig deep into the issues that affect your community the most. The WTIU-WFYI News Team is where you are and telling your story.
In a time of change, where can you find in-depth reporting and thoughtful analysis? Washington Week on PBS. Join moderator Robert Costa.
When I was at the Capitol this week, I encountered the same.
And a panel of award-winning journalists.
You're seeing a divided nation, and you're seeing.
For insights and perspective.
Tonight there was a key development in the
Senate. You won't find anywhere else.
What a week.
Washington Week.
Welcome back to Indiana Newsdesk. Well, the motorized scooters that arrived in Bloomington in 2018 continue to be a topic of conversation. One Bloomington resident had a specific question about the scooters for City Limits. Intern reporter Chloe Burris explains.
Since their introduction to Bloomington about a year ago, rental scooters from companies such as Bird and Lime have proven to be both a convenience and a nuisance to the city's residents. The rechargeable scooters have provided a means of convenient transportation around downtown and a handful of jobs for people as scooter mechanics or chargers. However, some Bloomington residents have objected to the scooters on grounds of safety, aesthetics, and accessibility. Kaylee Shearer wishes the scooter rules were better known and better followed. On any day, one could see several scooters lining both sides of the street on which she lives.
A few months ago, I started finding electric scooters parked in my yard. Which became problematic because every time I'd mow the yard, I'd have to move the scooters, and unless you pay, the wheels actually lock up. So moving the scooters out of my yard wasn't all that easy.
Kaylee asked City Limits to find out what she can do to keep these scooters from being parked on her private property, and if it is possible to have them impounded.
So after the electric scooters are charged, they're dropped off in locations, it's my understanding, and somehow my yard is one of those. Which does kind of bother me also, just that a company is making profit off of using my home for people to pick up their product.
While some city residents were alarmed by the scooters, city officials were also concerned with the lack of rules and regulations developed for this newly introduced mode of transportation. City council members spent several meetings debating the rules before adopting them in August. Michael Rooker is an attorney for the city of Bloomington.
And we had a lot of people who were seeing this new device, this new mode of transportation in town, who weren't used to it, who also were sort of asking very basic questions. You know, is this legal? What are the rules related to scooters? And because it was so new, you know, we hadn't even really developed those rules at this point in time. So we set about working on an interim operating agreement so we could just have some rough basic rules in place during that time period. And then this past summer, the city council passed a formal ordinance.
Rooker says that for getting inconveniently placed scooters moved, the options are limited.
So the city has the authority under the ordinance to impound a scooter that is improperly located on public property. Whether or not you could simply say, I'm going to take somebody else's property that's been mistakenly placed on my property or incorrectly placed on my property is going to be a difficult question.
Rooker also says that if Shearer or any other individual was unable to contact the scooter company, they could move the scooter from their property to a sidewalk, as long as they are complying with the ordinance. This would include not blocking the sidewalk or placing the scooters in a tree plot. The scooters also need to be standing upright and adjacent to a street sign. For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Chloe Burris.
A law that went into effect this year lifts some of the restrictions that local governments can impose on beekeepers. It's one way the state is getting involved to help protect bees. As Adam Pinsker reports, there are a number of threats facing the honeybee.
I'm watching for one to bring pollen in.
A third-generation beekeeper, Tracy Hunter, is in his happy place when he's with his bees.
There's nothing more enjoyable than just working in a beehive. It's a very relaxing time.
His sprawling honey farm outside Martinsville does agri-tours and is also a family business. He produces everything from sticks to honey candles.
Each worker bee only lives for about 40 days, about 4 to 6 weeks. And in her lifetime, she will produce 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey.
But bees in Indiana and around the world are in trouble, primarily because they're losing a lot of their habitat and parasites are destroying their hives.
I don't see any diseases.
In the 1980s, a beekeeper inadvertently introduced a parasitic mite into the bee population in Florida. It wasn't long before that mite reached Indiana.
We found out that they were vectors for viruses. And there's about 12 viruses that the mites carry and get into the honeybee's blood system.
Bees are also some of the largest non-native pollinators of crops in the United States. They pollinate plants, allowing them to grow seeds and fruits. That pollen is a food source for bees, but the areas in which the bees can get that pollen are becoming scarce.
So each one of these individual larvae will get a certain amount of the diet.
IU PhD student Audrey Parrish is among several people trying to determine the effect parasites, pesticides, and other factors like climate have on honeybees.
You can imagine a situation where deforestation and expansion of agriculture is knocking out the natural floral resources that these honeybees are typically experiencing. And because of that, they're not able to get pollen, and so the larvae aren't able to get protein.
Fellow PhD candidate Delaney Miller is trying to develop a microbe to protect bees from certain diseases.
I collect larvae from the field and rear them here in the lab. And then either subject them to this microbe or without it. And then I challenge them with fungal infection and see if they are more likely to survive fungal infection.
While honeybees aren't the only flower and crop pollinators out there, the loss or sharp decline of the species would have an impact on nearly everyone.
The number of apples that could be pollinated by the current populations of native pollinators would be smaller. And they would be extraordinarily expensive and outside of the price range that most people would be willing to pay or able to pay.
According to a survey from a national beekeeping industry group in the 7 months between October of 2018 and April of 2019, 37% of managed honeybee hives were lost in the U.S. More than 24 states have passed laws to protect bees. Some states have placed restrictions on pesticides to try to help bees. Others have placed some bee species on protected lists. In May, Governor Eric Holcomb signed a bill that forbids municipalities from banning beekeeping in their cities. In Hunter's opinion, the law makes sense because an increasing number of Hoosiers want to start their own hives, and the law prevents any local government from getting in the way.
I would say in the last 20 years, backyard beekeepers or hobbyist beekeepers, those with 1 to 6 hives, they have increased tremendously, and now we have over 1,000 beekeepers in Indiana.
But Hunter says you don't have to be a beekeeper to make a difference. He says planting more wildflowers that attract bees and always buying local honey, not generic store brands, will help, as well as cutting back on the use of pesticides. He says it's more about an attitude change than anything else.
The American consumer talks out of 2 sides of their mouth. I think one, they say, I want to buy organic food. On the other side, they're spraying, they don't want dandelions in their yards, so they spray to kill the dandelions.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Adam Pinsker.
Well, after its first closure for updates since it opened in 2003, Wonderlab Science Museum is back open with new exhibits meant to help the youngest learners. Reporter Tyler Lake has more.
The museum has long been a draw for curious young learners, and now it's trying to get kids started even earlier. After a lot of planning and construction, the Bloomington Museum is opening their doors to the Science Sprouts Place, the new exhibit for infants and toddlers. Project Director Karen Jepson-Ennis says the secret science behind the exhibit helps young children with language development and social cognition.
They're really active learners, and there's so much cognitive development that's happening in that first year of life. So we really wanted to celebrate that and showcase how important it is.
With the help of sponsors, the museum was able to integrate vital science and learning into play. The museum collaborated with early childhood professionals and faculty from the Indiana University Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences to inspire curiosity and creativity in infants and toddlers. Early childhood specialist Robin Frisch says exposing children to this kind of environment as soon as possible is essential for brain development.
Right. We truly believe that young children are born as young scientists. Children learn about their world through their senses, through their movements, and that's all about science.
For Indiana Newsdesk, I'm Tyler Lake.
And it might be good to do some inside stuff this weekend. Highs in the 50s, except don't forget if you're going out to the ISU or IU homecoming this weekend to bundle up. That's the end of this program, but our work continues online as we cover the news throughout the week at WTIUnews.org. Have a great weekend.
Indiana Newsdesk is made possible in part by Smithville Fiber Internet, streaming TV, home security and automation in Southern Indiana. More information at smithville.com. Maller Grodner Attorneys, providing legal services to clients and the community. Understanding, expertise, results. Bloomington and Indianapolis. lawmg.com. IU Alumni Association, connecting IU's network of alumni and sharing the Indiana spirit through scholarships, advocacy, and volunteerism. alumni.iu.edu. IU Center for Rural Engagement, extending IU Bloomington resources to improve Hoosier lives in partnership with communities and organizations. rural.indiana.edu. And by WTIU members. Thank you.